Bismillah, alhamdulillah, as-salatu was-salam ala rasulillah.
But the question arises, why should we spend so much time, as we do in this course, on the history of atheism? This is an important topic because most of today's conversation focuses on new atheism, as if atheism popped out of nowhere, as if atheism is just a new phenomenon and we have to really focus on what's going on in the here and the now. But new atheism is just a small part of atheism as a whole. It's a small part of the history of atheism. So we have to understand this historical context at large and not be just influenced by what we see today with the most prominent social media and media coverage of the quote-unquote new atheists. So inshallah in the course we're going to talk about new atheism, but we're going to spend a lot more time talking about what has led to the emergence of these new atheists. Also, this is a rhetorical strategy from new atheists. Atheists want to treat atheism as if it were something universal, as if it's something that's just common sense, that doesn't have a historical development. Basically, it's a rational state of mind, so it doesn't have this kind of diversity, first of all. It doesn't have a pluralistic tradition, and it's something that doesn't have an extended history. This serves the atheist narrative that atheism is just something commonsensical. Atheism is something that occurs to the rational mind naturally. But the reality is, all atheistic arguments have a historical development. And the reality is, atheists today are very different than atheists 100 years ago or 200 years ago. Atheists in one part of the world are very different from atheists in other parts of the world. And atheists themselves, if they're honest within academia, will recognize this, and we're going to talk about some of these atheistic academic thinkers. But it's important, it's so important for us to study this history and this tradition because it parochializes, it localizes atheism so that we don't fall into the mistake of thinking that atheism, doubting the existence of God, doubting the creator is just something common sense or is something that's just rational, because that's the narrative that atheists promote, and we're going to undercut that, inshallah. We're going to undercut that narrative by actually studying the diversity of atheistic thought and also its historical development. Another important question is, why should we as Muslims care about the topic of atheism? And I'll give you three reasons. Number one, Muslim youth are turning to atheism in the US and around the world. Alhamdulillah, it's not, a massive movement of Muslims becoming atheists, but it's definitely affecting certain families and certain communities, and so we need to be able to address that. Number two, doubts about Islam are created in the community. Okay, so atheistic narrative and atheistic ideas affect the community, even though there's not necessarily many Muslims who are converting to atheism, leaving Islam. So we have to be concerned about that impact of those atheist ideas on our community, because when there is the influence of atheism, then unfortunately this affects the moral resolve of the community. There's a hit to our morale as Muslims. There's less confidence, there's less yaqeen, there's less of that kind of commitment to Islam that drives the community and drives individuals towards obeying Allah and to be devoted to Islam in the correct way. So this has an effect. We have to be able to recognize this effect of atheism on the Muslim community. And the third reason, and perhaps you can think of even more than these three, but these are the main three that I thought of, is that atheism impacts our da'wah. because there are certain arguments against God and therefore against Islam that are just in the air. They're just in the water within the Western discourse. On social media, in popular media, you have certain figures, celebrities who are atheists and who propound certain atheistic ideas. And so these thoughts and these ideas are affecting the world at large. And so if we as Muslims are going and proposing that, yes, there is a true God, he exists, he is the creator, and he is worthy of worship, and there are no other gods, and everything else that Islam entails, then we're going to get pushback, we're going to get a resistance from people who are affected by atheistic arguments. So we have to be able to navigate that and think strategically and act strategically in order to counteract that, in order to do dawah, in order to call people to Islam. So those are the three main reasons. And one of the things that personally makes me invested in the topic of atheism is that oftentimes I'll go to a masjid community and I will be approached by a tearful mother or father who tell me that their son or their daughter has left Islam. And they'll say that my son and daughter have been influenced by atheistic ideas. Can you please help me? Can you please talk to them? And these parents are very troubled and they're very confused because their children, they have worked so hard to make sure that their children are being raised with proper Islamic morals, proper Islamic practice. We're talking about children who were going to the masjid, who were attending Islamic classes. Some of them might have even memorized a large portion of the Quran, maybe even gone overseas and studied. And so these parents have, mashallah, done everything that they can to positively influence their children. And then suddenly this child goes to college and within one semester has decided to leave Islam. So this is something very troubling. This is something that we all should be concerned about. What is it that's affecting these youth? Again, it's a small percentage, but it's still something that needs to be addressed. And of course, there are spiritual factors, there are social factors that affect the way that a child or a college student feels and thinks about their own belief. But there's also intellectual factors. Okay? And that's what we're going to be focusing on for the purposes of this course, because we want to understand when a Muslim youth goes to college and is taking maybe a philosophy course, or is taking a critical reasoning course, some of these introductory courses, their whole purpose is to get the student to question truth and to question some of the biggest beliefs that they have. And religion and the belief in God is the biggest belief that most people have. And so the whole purpose of these courses intellectually is to raise doubts in the mind of that person. But again, this kind of doubt has its own history. There's an atheistic intellectual tradition that we want to study and we need to study in order to prepare our young people for this kind of onslaught, within the college environment and outside of it as well. Okay, so personally, this is something that I find very troubling when Muslim parents come to me and tell me about how their children are affected negatively by this. And then some children have this kind of doubt, because even though they've gone to all of the Islamic classes that their masjid has offered, they've gone maybe to Islamic school, maybe they've studied overseas, but then they go to the college environment and then there's this whole topic that oftentimes hasn't been addressed. The topic of atheism, the topic of critical thinking, the topic of philosophy. And so there's a kind of doubt that arises in the mind. Why haven't my parents told me anything about atheism? Why didn't my imam talk to me or mention this topic of atheism? Is it because they themselves don't know the answers to the challenges of atheism? Could it be because they're scared of this topic because it's so convincing that they haven't even approached or broached that topic with me, their child, their student. So this is the kind of doubt that some children might have when they go into the college environment. And so parents especially should have familiarity and have some kind of confidence in talking about this subject and broaching this subject, introducing the subject in our own terms, in an Islamic framework, right? In the household, in the masjid, in the community, so that we are more informed, right? Because living in the West or in the East, it doesn't matter, because social media connects the entire world. Everyone is going to get exposed to this topic. And so we have to inoculate ourselves with the proper knowledge, the proper information, so that it doesn't seem like we have our heads stuck in the sand and we're too scared to address these kinds of issues. Francis Bacon, Robert Boyle, with their empiricism and their scientism. And so these are religious figures, and they are trying to defend religion. They're trying to defend God. But in the process, they are proposing theories that are cut off from God and do not have that kind of religious basis. And then in politics as well, we see figures like John Locke, who, despite being very religious, he is trying to create and define a political theory that is not explicitly religious, and in fact is open to tolerance of a variety of faiths within one political system. So these kinds of theories take elements of shirk, because they're taking the epistemology, the ontology, and the morality that should be solely unto God. They are now saying that these have an independent basis. We can have an ontology that is independent of God by proposing things like the laws of nature and secondary causes and this kind of clockwork mechanical universe. We can have a politics and a morality that's independent of God, independent of revelation. We can have an epistemology known as rationalism or empiricism, independent of revelation. So this is something that smacks of shirk. And as we described, this is something that Western civilization was more prone to, because it had already been steeped in shirk because of Christianity. So they transitioned in this stage from one type of shirk into another type of shirk. But full-blown atheism didn't come until the next stage, as we get into the 18th century with the philosophers and the Enlightenment thinkers. They took the theories of the previous century and they pushed them to their secular atheistic conclusions. If we can arrive at truth and understand the universe and understand morality without God and religion, then why bother with God and religion? These epistemologies, ontologies, and normativities are independent, and we don't have any use for a religious mentality. And so then you find this attack on religion as science and rationality and a liberal morality are being used to attack Christianity and even other religions as well, including Islam, including Judaism, and so forth. So this is the third stage. Then the thing about Nietzsche also is that he became more unhinged. He became mentally ill, and he didn't live very long. He died when he was 40. But he was really in the throes of madness towards the end of his life. And I think one quote is very interesting. He says that, "I find the founder of Christendom superficial in comparison with myself." So he's talking about Jesus Christ, and he's saying that I find Jesus Christ superficial in comparison to myself. He even at one point considered himself to be the Antichrist. He considered himself to be the Antichrist, and so he had descended into this kind of madness towards the end of his life, and he was not even a functioning person. And it's not hard to see why these kinds of ideas that he is proposing are so wild in their implications. And if you really follow through with some of these beliefs, it's going to drive you to insanity and to madness. And that seems to be very clear in the biography of Friedrich Nietzsche. There was one quote that Strumsa cites from Ibn al-Jawzi, rahimahullah, on Rawandi. And Ibn al-Jawzi says that we have never heard anyone defame the Creator and make jest about him as much as this cursed one did. Had he denied the Creator altogether, it would have been better for him than to admit his existence, than to polemicize against him and defame him. So this is Ibn al-Jawzi's statement on Rawandi, but note that Ibn al-Jawzi acknowledges that Rawandi did not deny the Creator entirely. He was not denying God's entirely or even the Creator entirely. Now let's talk about a truly disturbing individual, Marquis de Sade. Marquis de Sade. And he is someone that you can fully describe as a mezo-theist. A mezo-theist, as opposed to just a standard atheist, is that a mezo-theist hates God. A mezo-theist not only hates the idea of God, a meso-theist not only hates the idea of religion, the meso-theist actually hates God himself and seems to have a pathological anger and towards God and a desire to blaspheme God and to go against God in what he does. And so it's very satanic in nature, but Marquis de Sade was one of these figures. And the term sadism is coming from him. Sadism means taking pleasure from inflicting harm, taking pleasure, whether it's sexual pleasure or other kinds of pleasure, from hurting other people and from being violent. And so he was very perverse. He was just a disgusting human being. And he was influenced heavily by D'Holbach, and he was intensely anti-Christian. His focus was mainly on Christianity. He didn't really comment on other religions. He was writing erotic fiction that featured things like rape, violence, all kinds of homosexuality. And so his whole purpose was to be obscene and to almost want to taunt and mock God with the kind of behaviors like this. And so he goes way beyond the hedonism of other French libertines. He actually goes and makes it extremely disgusting on purpose, deliberately. So what's the evidence for these kinds of views from de Sade? He had a book called 120 Days of Sodom. And he has one character in there who's a bishop who says the following: the doctrine which must perpetually govern our conduct is the more pleasure you seek in the depth of crime, the more frightful the crime must be. And so he has this idea that you want to truly get pleasure from crime, then the more frightful, the more horrifying the crime is, then the more pleasure it's going to bring you. And another character responds to this: there are but 2 or 3 crimes to perform in this world, and they once done, there's no more to be said. All the rest is inferior. You cease any longer to feel. So he is describing the desensitization to crime. And you become numb after being so debauched and committing so many vile deeds, then, okay, there's just 1, 2, or 3 kinds of wicked things that you can do. There's only so many vices that you commit. And this is how he is being driven. Like, he wants more. What more can there be? What more kind of disgusting behavior is there? I've tried everything. I've done everything. And it's still not enough. It's still not enough. It's still not enough. And this is, we know in Islam, this is exactly how people are driven to commit vile behavior and to sink into the depths of depravity because of this human nature that Allah has given us, that the nafs always wants more. And so in this 120 days of Sodom, he is elaborating this. And then he says something very telling. He says, how many times, by God, have I not longed to be able to assail the sun, snatch it out of the universe, make a general darkness, or use that star to burn the world? Oh, that would be a crime. Oh yes, and not a little misdemeanor, such as are all the ones we perform that are limited in a whole year's time, metamorphosing a dozen creatures into lumps of clay. So see how vile this is. He's saying metamorphosing or metamorphizing human beings to a lump of clay. He means murder. He means killing. He means the destruction of life. And even that seems banal to him. That seems like, so what? You're just changing clay from one form into another form. Right? There's no, on the materialistic philosophy, where there's no soul, then there's no difference between someone who is alive and someone who's dead. It's just a lump of clay. So this is, supposed to be crime to kill. Like, that seems kind of trivial and pedestrian to Marquis de Sade. He says, no, a real crime, a real source of pleasure would be to just take the sun and use it to burn life, to burn the earth. That's something that can really give us pleasure and to really be an affront to God himself.